Welcome back. This is Ranking the Colorado 14ers, Part 3. So we left off in the middle of my week in the San Juans back in 2019. Right after I climbed Sneffels, drove over to the Purgatory Trailhead and hiked in for the Chicago Basin peaks. So going into the Weminuche Wilderness to climb the Chicago Basin peaks is truly one of the coolest 14er experiences. It really is a wilderness backpacking trip with 4 really interesting summits deep in the wilderness, surrounded by the most intense and interesting mountains in Colorado, the Needle Mountains. So the first of the 14ers I climbed is Sunlight Peak. And this was a really exciting climb. It starts out, it gets better and better the higher you get. Starts out with kind of a loose gully to get up onto the peak itself, and then some interesting route finding to get through some boulders up toward the summit. And the summit itself is a super interesting jumble of massive boulders that are all just kind of leaned against each other, and to get to the very top you're kind of sidestepping across and then doing a lunge and then finally getting up on top of the highest block, and it's crazy exposed. But then the most fun is getting off of that block again. You actually have to do a no hands, no feet leap to get back to the boulder below. And it's just a crazy, crazy exciting moment that really stands out as far as 14er summits go. So I'm going to put Sunlight in the A tier. So Sunlight's right next to Windom Peak. And I remember Windom just being an absolute series of just stair steps, box jumps, like just big boulders that you're kind of just climbing up one at a time and slowly making progress up this ridge. A little bit more simple than Sunlight, but a pretty cool peak on its own as well. I'll go for B tier for Windom Peak. So then on the other side of the basin is North Eolus. So this is another unranked peak, pretty minor sub-summit of Mount Eolus. Not too much to say other than the rock quality is pretty good, and it does give you a pretty good vantage over at Mount Eolus, where most folks are going to be headed next. Let's put North Eolus in C. So then Mount Eolus has a pretty cool route, has an interesting catwalk that you have to go across to get over onto the upper mountain. But then navigating across the face is just some of the craziest route finding. There's loads of cairns and even some flagging tape that people had left out there to try and mark a route, but it was not obvious at all. And I think I took a completely different way down than the way I went up. But it's a cool peak, really prominent, and again, in one of the best locations anywhere in Colorado as far as true wilderness with rugged mountains. So I'll put Eolus up with Windom in the B tier. So I got those 4 peaks done in a day, which was a total highlight of climbing the 14ers for sure. So I did do the longer backpack approach from the Purgatory Trailhead, and it's a great trail. It's actually a really nice approach. You're kind of following the Animas River for several miles. I think it ends up being like 16 miles one way to get back into the basin, but just a great way to experience that side of the Weminuche Wilderness and again get it all the way in on your own power. So I would recommend doing that as well. But the train is also pretty fun. So the next day, hiked out of the basin again, that was 16 miles, and then drove over to the next trailhead and hiked up that approach, which was to Navajo Lake for El Diente and Mount Wilson. So El Diente is unranked, but a pretty interesting mountain, pretty unique. It has this kind of blocky, tooth-shaped summit that gives it its name. I climbed a non-standard route up El Diente, which was the North Buttress, and that was pretty cool. It was based on a trip report I had found. There were a few different kind of named sections and different snowfields that I was identifying to know which way to go, and just some interesting route finding puzzles to make my way up that thing, but nothing ever got too steep or too technically difficult. And then set my sights from El Diente over toward Mount Wilson. And so the El Diente to Mount Wilson traverse is the second of the 4 great traverses. And this one has a reputation for being really poor rock quality, really loose, and pretty dangerous for that reason. Yeah, it's another ridge where you have, some towers, these things called the organ pipes that you just kind of snake your way around, and you don't have to climb to every little pinnacle that you come across. But there is a good head wall over toward the end of the traverse on coming up Mount Wilson, which is definitely a highlight. I remember it being pretty solid and fun, good holds, and getting up on Mount Wilson and looking back at the traverse was definitely a proud moment. So El Diente and Wilson are pretty great. I'm going to go ahead and put them in B as well. So after finishing that traverse, I set my sights on nearby Wilson Peak, which is separate but nearby to Mount Wilson. Dropped back down to Navajo Lake, climbed up the Rock of Ages saddle, and once I topped out over that saddle, just discovered this absolutely horrific black thunderstorm that was headed my way that I wasn't able to see until that moment. So gave up on climbing that peak, turned around, went back to camp, and got hailed on the way down. But got back up the next morning and had a really enjoyable climb. So I found Wilson Peak to be pretty similar to Mount Wilson. They both had one pretty memorable sort of crux section of a steeper class 3 to 4 head wall, but both were pretty good rock and good holds and fun climbing. And yeah, I really enjoyed getting up Wilson Peak and looking back over toward El Diente and Wilson from the day before and seeing that skyline ridge was pretty neat. The Wilson group itself is way far out in the southwest corner of Colorado, so it feels really remote, really rugged. You can see Utah from up there, and I really enjoyed these peaks, hoping to get back in that area soon. I'll put Wilson Peak up in A tier. So I had one day left in my vacation and headed out over to San Luis Peak, which compared to a lot of these ridges and scrambles was pretty straightforward and simple. But I did have some difficulty with the weather. There was a thunderstorm that rolled in and it turned me around, and I ended up waiting it out and catching another second weather window in the afternoon and getting the summit. San Luis Peak I've come back to a couple times. There's a number of other 13ers in the area, and its La Garita Wilderness is a pretty nice zone. It's a lot of these kind of big, high, rounded peaks, but very quiet, a lot of wildlife back there, and not often climbed because it is pretty remote and out on its own. Let's go C tier for San Luis. Why not? Okay, so after that San Juan's mission, I continued later on into the season to climb Mount Massive, second highest peak. It's a pretty cool mountain with a lot of different routes. It has multiple different named sub-summits, all of which are above 14,000 feet. So Mount Massive is definitely true to its name. It's a big day any way you go. But the route that I did for my first time, I went on the south side, which is kind of the steeper, shorter alternative to the standard route on the east ridge. And yeah, I found it to be a pretty decent climb, just walking up a trail. It definitely felt more straightforward than the peaks that I had just come from in the San Juans. I've enjoyed Mount Massive, but generally it's kind of middle of the road. We'll go C tier as well. Another combination. This is Kit Carson and Challenger. So these two peaks are really just two different summits on the broad Kit Carson Mountain, which also includes the Centennial Columbia Point. So my friends and I went up the North Ridge route of Kit Carson, which was a really cool scramble, pretty exposed up to class 4, but just a pretty direct line up to the top. And that was a really cool climb. Again, that kind of really solid rock quality that you can find in that area with the crest stones and around there. And super fun climb, great day out. We camped down at Willow Lake, which is always a good spot. So the standard route goes up over Challenger. Challenger itself is not too much to write home about. It's just a bump up there, and the route down is pretty loose, rough climber's trail, a lot of erosion. So I would definitely recommend climbing up Kit Carson instead of climbing up Challenger to connect the two. So Kit Carson's really cool. I'll put that up in A tier. But then Challenger, unfortunately, is not the best, and that's going to go down in D tier. Okay, so by that time it was early October, but the weather was holding out, the fall colors were out, and I wanted to get in one more peak for the season. Last season I had climbed Long's Peak at the end of the year as kind of a reach toward a more complicated, more challenging route. I did the same this year and went for Capitol Peak. Many people would consider it to be the most dangerous 14er, but that's certainly debatable. Capitol Peak is back in the Elk Mountains, and it sits there off on its own at the head of the Capitol Creek drainage, which at this time of the year was just absolute golden wonderland of aspens and absolutely stunning climb. So I went up to the summit in a day. A lot of folks do camp at Capitol Lake, and that's a great option. So climbing up above Capitol Lake, you gain the ridge and then climb this small sub-summit known as K2. And I found getting around K2 to be pretty cruxy and difficult as far as just route finding and finding an easy way around this thing. But then that drops you off at the famous knife edge, and everybody talks about the knife edge, and it's definitely a totally unforgettable and super unique moment to get up there. It really is a super narrow, blocky ridge that just falls off pretty steeply in both directions. Super exposed, but easy enough to kind of crawl or scoot or, balance your way across that short section. But then what really surprised me was the rest of the mountain after the knife edge to get up to the summit was similar to Mount Eolus in that it was just a lot of route finding, zigzagging back and forth across this face, trying to find an easy way and not really finding one. There's a lot of loose rock up there. It had me missing the knife edge for how solid and trustworthy that rock was, because everything above it is just loose, steep, and dangerous. So I was relieved to make it to the summit and take a look around up there before heading back down the route again, which took just as long as it did to get up. I think it was something like 5 hours that I was up above from the saddle, to the summit and back. And that's just a long time to be really mentally focused on testing every rock, checking every foothold, managing every move you're making. And it was a pretty exhausting climb, but felt within my abilities, and I did enjoy it overall. And hiking back out from the lake, I took a different trail to get back to the car and sort of made a loop out of it. And just stunning to look back again over at all those aspens and see that peak off in the distance, and super memorable climb. And I really would recommend this time of year to do it. No thunderstorms, amazing fall colors, but definitely not for beginners, definitely pretty intense. And it does deserve its reputation as one of the most dangerous peaks for sure. So Capitol Peak, I'll put in a very formidable and scary S tier. It's a serious mountaineering objective and one of Colorado's most demanding climbs for sure. And that's a wrap on season 2. So good mix of peaks again here. Great to finish up those climbs in the San Juans, get another one of the 4 great traverses. And topping everything off with Capitol Peak at the end was super memorable and definitely a trip that I'm still pretty proud of. So we'll pick it up again with season 3 in the next video. Subscribe to keep up with the rest of the series.